Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Q&A with the Planning Department and City Council on the neighborhood residential zoning and the urban residential zoning. Thanks for bearing with us. I know there have been some good conversations happening outside. We're going to tonight have a presentation and introduction from the Director of Planning Development and Sustainability, Alicia Hunt, and our zoning consultant, Emily Innes. And then we're going to move to a Q&A. We also have planner Danielle Evans and Paula Ramos Martinez from Innes Associates. They are out in the rotunda with a number of large maps, and those are maps that folks can put post-it notes on with their comments and also have some discussions if they have want to have a longer conversation with Paula and Danielle in the rotunda. So with that, thank you for being here, and we're going to get started with Director Hunt.
Recording in progress.
Good evening. Thank you. Yes, I'm Alicia Hunt. I'm the Director of Planning, Development, and Sustainability for the city. And so my office has been working jointly with the City Council on this zoning effort. Our consultant, Emily, will actually speak a little bit more about like the big picture and all. But we started with a comprehensive plan. We have been doing a lot of different zoning. This evening, we're here to talk about residential zoning, residential zones. There are lots of different chunks happening. But I do just sort of I'm going to say it again, because a few other people floated in, is that we have a presentation. And then we're going to do some Q&A, and this isn't like public comment where you get 2 minutes and you're done. We actually want to answer your questions and have some level of conversation. But if you really want to have a deep conversation or speak to very specifically about your parcel or neighborhood, you may want to speak with Paula or Danielle out in the hallway, and you can do that at any time you choose to, because they have maps that you can point to and find your house on, and they can get into more detail, and then we'll invite you to also leave post-it notes on those out there as well. So at any point, you can choose that you prefer to be talking to them. And so Emily Innes of Innes Associates is the planning consultant that we have hired along with her team. And we have a legal firm, Jonathan Silverstein, as well, who has been working with us on this zoning. And I'm going to turn it over to Emily because I'm going to say otherwise everything that she's planning to say.
Fair enough. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone in the room, and good evening, everyone online. Very nice to see you all here. I'm going to just take a moment to share my screen. I'm going to walk you through the presentation that kind of gives you the big picture of what we've been doing and why we're here, and then focuses you down onto the topic for tonight, which is the residential neighborhoods. So we've done the introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about the comprehensive plan and show you some of the analysis work that we did. Actually, it's last year now, but that fed into our discussions about the residential districts, and then take you on kind of a district by district exposition or explanation of what we're recommending as this draft. I do want to stress that this is very much a draft right now. The reason that we're having a public meeting sponsored by the City Council is we really want your input. So think of this as we've been working with the Planning and Permitting Committee. We've come up with sort of what we think is the framework for this. We want to check in with the public and see what they think. And that's why your questions, your comments, your thoughts today are so important. But also, again, if you have anything specific, make sure that you look at the maps in detail, because even with the screen up here instead of back here, it can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to see. So feel free to go back and forth. So we've introduced ourselves. So this is a multi-year process. The City Council started with a recodification project that started back in 2020. Recodification is really going through the existing zoning. Are there errors or typos? Are there best practices that haven't been incorporated? So the legal firm that was working with the city at the time went through that process, but it doesn't really talk about what should change in terms of new things. So the comprehensive plan was the next step. And the comprehensive plan looks at the citywide from about a 50,000 level view is how we always talk about it. And it looks to say the next 10 to 15 years of what should happen in the city. What are the policy changes? What's the direction that the community wants to go through? Where do they want to be in 10 to 15, or even sometimes looking out beyond that? And one of the first steps after a comprehensive planning process is to realign the zoning with a comprehensive plan. So that's what we've been working on. We started last year, actually roughly this time, roughly in March, to look at that. The first thing was the city had already made some tweaks. So we did the urgent edits, we called it. There were some unintended consequences where the recodifications changed something that wasn't meant to be changed. So we cleaned that up, and editing errors. And then starting after June of last year, starting in July, we really started focusing on those next steps. So we've done the Mystic Avenue. We, of course, had the conversations about Salem Street. We added the green score to address sustainability and concerns about climate change. Those have all been passed. And now we're in a process of looking tonight with you at the neighborhoods, and then looking forward to the commercial districts. So these are some of the things that came out of the comprehensive plan, the different, and I'm assuming that's all clear. The different goals that came out of the comprehensive plan, so that we're keeping these in mind as we move forward. So climate resilience, access for all, housing, and economic development. This is your current zoning map. This is what we're looking at changing piece by piece. It is the kind of the broad brush strokes that many communities use, where large areas were zoned for one thing, but it doesn't necessarily take into account the different characteristics of the neighborhoods, of the commercial areas, the squares, Medford Square and West Medford Square, or what we've called corridors, which are those longer streets that touch the neighborhoods, but frequently have a lot more commercial or institutional along them. So this was the future land use map that came out of the comprehensive plan. It talked about corridors, centers and squares, and neighborhoods. And you can see that there were these sort of big blobs of color that identified them. And part of our strategy has been to look more and more closely at the different areas of Medford to try and figure out the zoning. So when we look at the residential districts today on the maps, you're going to see some areas in white, and that's because there are these areas that are in color on this map now. These are the mixed-use districts. So Mystic Avenue, Salem Street, Medford Square and West Medford, the institutional area, some of the other corridors in there, Wellington. These are all areas that have a mix of uses. They're both commercial and residential. We've talked about some of them already. We're continuing to talk about them right now. In fact, Paula met with the Planning and Permitting Committee last night to talk about Medford Square. But for today, we're going to focus on residential. And we did a lot of analysis last summer. I'm going to show a few of the maps today on this presentation. They're all on the city's website, and some of them are printed out in large scale in the hall. So feel free to go and look at them. One of the things that we looked at were the types of residential dwellings that exist now. A lot of single family, that's that light lavender on there. Quite a bit of two family, some condo conversions, quite a bit of three family. And then we broke it down into sort of different scales of housing. So we had 4 to 8 units and 9+ units. We also had a few in the bright pink where you had more than one house or more than one residential building per parcel. So that started to give us an idea of what's here now. So how do we react to that? How do we think about maybe some of these are non-conforming, which means that the existing residential buildings aren't actually matching the current zoning. We find that's very common in New England because in most places, zoning didn't come in until the 1920s, or, at one town I'm working with, their first zoning bylaw was 1967. And if you think of how long development development has been happening in New England, the fact that zoning came in so late meant that you're going to have a lot of neighborhoods that don't match the zoning. So that's one of the first things we think of. And there are implications if your house or your lot doesn't match the zoning. What that means is that you may have to go, say you want to put a porch on the front of your house, and you're too close to the street. You're within what's called the front yard setback. Well, in order to do that, if you're non-conforming, you don't meet the requirements, you have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals. You have to request a variance. Makes it a lot more time-consuming and expensive to do that. So one of the first things we try to see is, are there areas where we can reduce the number of non-conformities? We can reduce the burden on households for doing that. We also took a look at those existing conditions. So lot sizes is where are lots larger in Medford? Where are they smaller in Medford? What might that mean? How does that relate to the current zoning? And we found, of course, that there are a lot of lots that are much smaller than the zoning currently allows for. We looked at frontage. That's the length of the lot along the street, and what does it mean? When the frontage is shorter, is smaller than what's required by zoning. Well, you're non-conforming, but it also starts to let us know, as the lot sizes do, because your frontage is a component of that dimension, that there may be areas of Medford where the lot sizes, the frontages aren't matching up with the zoning, and we want to think about what that means. Height is another thing. Height is a frequent conversation in communities, because when you're walking down a street, you generally notice what the front setback is. That's the distance between the building and the street, and you generally notice what the height is. Is it shading you? Is it allowing sun in? Do you feel that it's too tall? Is it too short? So we did an analysis of the existing heights, and all of these are based on the assessor's data. The Board of Assessors collects data for each parcel, and then we can put this into a geographic information system, or GIS, and do these calculations and show you what it looks like. And in fact, this height map is outside, so you can have a look at it. We also looked at the historical inventory. This is MACRIS, which is the Massachusetts Historical Commission, has an online database and an online what's called GIS layer of all of the assets, all of the inventoried properties throughout Massachusetts. And we took those layers and overlaid them on Medford to see where are the historic areas. What does it mean to think about those historic areas? What does it mean to preserve those historic buildings? And is there a way that through zoning is certainly not the only tool. It's not even necessarily the best tool for historic preservation, but we can do some things within the zoning to create incentives for historic preservation. So we wanted to think about that. And then also the transit system, right? We want to think about where people live in relationship to their ability to move around. Are they near a bus line? Are they near a commuter rail? Are they near a T-stop? And what does that mean for locating people? When we think about housing, we think about where is it in relation to transit? Where is it in relation to jobs? Where is it in relation to goods and services? How easy is it for somebody to get from where they live to the things that they need or the things that they want? And of course, for a place like Medford, we also want to think about how close is it to recreation, right? You have so many recreational assets as well. So there are far more maps than that, and those are all online, but I wanted to introduce you to sort of some of the bigger categories that we think about and why we're thinking about them. Some of the considerations when we were starting to zoom down just into the residential districts. So I mentioned the proximity, the ability to access transit. This map came from the comprehensive plan, and it's proximity to higher densities of job areas. So the stronger the pink on this, the more jobs are in that area. So we wanted to think about, again, co-locating housing near jobs is really important. You saw the lot size map already. What you can't see on the screen, but you could see if you went outside or if you went to the maps online and looked at them. There's a lot of topographical changes in Medford, and that's important to think about in terms of access for pedestrians, for bicyclists, for vehicles as well. There's some parts of Medford where there are some narrow streets. There's also a lot of Medford where there are private ways rather than public ways. I'm going to show you a map of that, or a draft map of that next. And then we wanted to think about, as I mentioned already, the existing residential types. We also wanted to think about transitions. So, we mentioned Medford Square, for example. We had the meeting last night. We're talking about different height levels. If you're in Medford Square, what is it like? What does it feel like to walk or drive from Medford Square to the residential neighborhoods? How do you transition in height? How do you transition in other characteristics from there to the residential neighborhoods? So one of the things that we were thinking about is those transitions, and what does that mean for zoning as well, and for the dimensional standards in zoning. So I mentioned the private ways. This map is a map of the private ways, or at least it was a draft map of the private ways at the time that this was here. And those green lines on here are the private ways. So there's quite a few. So in thinking about access to land, how is where is it publicly owned access and where is it privately owned access? Just feeds into the many different characteristics that we're thinking about. So in these proposed residential districts, this is what it looks like if you put them all together. So we've got a new neighborhood residential 1 district, neighborhood residential 2, neighborhood residential 3, urban residential 1, and urban residential 2. And in all of the maps that you're going to see going forward, we're going to break them down so they pop out a little bit more. If you're a land use planner, you'd be questioning our use of color here, but when you have all of these as residential only, they should all be yellow. There's only a finite number of yellows that work together on a single map and are still readable. So we heard loud and clear that it was less readable to others than it could have been. So we've got these changes. So neighborhood residential 1 is the lightest yellow in here. It is a single unit dwelling, historic conversion, or accessory dwelling units. So many of you may have heard that there is a new state law about accessory dwelling units. We are working with the city to update their current zoning ordinance on accessory dwelling units. So I'm just going to mention that they are allowed in all of these districts, but we're still going back and forth on the tax. So we don't have the specifics for you available today. So looking at the numbers, as you go up in numbers, so neighborhood residential 1, 2, 3, you are also going up in the types of housing that are allowed and the number of units per parcel that are allowed. So neighborhood residential 2 is single unit dwelling, 2 unit dwelling, historic conversion, and ADU. And this is a good time to talk about the differences in historic conversion among the different districts here. So what we've tried to do in order to create an incentive to preserve historic houses is to allow 1 more unit for the historic conversion than is allowed in the underlying district. So neighborhood residential 1, which allows single unit dwellings. If you want to convert a historic building, you can go up to 2 units in it. Neighborhood residential 2, which allows single and 2 unit dwellings, you can go have a historic conversion of 2 to 3 units. And what that does is it just gives a little bit more of an incentive in each district to preserve those historic buildings without, say, allowing single unit only in neighborhood residential 1 and 6 units in a historic conversion. You're always just 1 unit more. There are other ways to do that, but that's what we're proposing for discussion today. Neighborhood residential 3, you can have a single unit dwelling, 2 unit dwelling, 3 unit dwelling, townhouse, historic conversion of 2 to 4 units, so that's that 1 unit more, an ADU. Urban residential 1, we're starting to increase the density slightly by going everything that you can do in neighborhood residential 3 except single unit dwellings. So it's 2 unit, townhouse, 3 unit, historic conversion 2 to 5 units, and what we're calling multiplex, which is 4 to 6 units. We're allowing ADUs for 1, 2, and 3 unit dwellings. So this is a little bit more permissive than the state law. Urban residential 2, townhouse, 3 unit dwelling, multiplex, 3 to 6 units, multiple unit dwelling of greater than 6 units, but limited to 3 stories, and then the ADUs. And from there, we've heard some questions already about, why aren't we going higher perhaps for urban residential 2? At that point, you're starting to butt up against the corridors and the squares and those other districts. And so the idea is now you're going to have that transition upwards to what's allowed on, for example, Mystic Avenue, where you can have significantly more height, but some of these residential neighborhoods are butting up. So we're thinking of that transition where urban residential 2 is really the sort of the highest limit for the residential only neighborhoods. And at that point, you're going into a mixed use district after that, and the rules are slightly different. That is not true everywhere because of the complexity of the terrain and the development patterns in Medford, but that's the general concept. This map here shows you where each of the districts is. That's the black outline and the code on it. So NR2 is neighborhood residential 2, for example, and it shows you the underlying existing residential types. And we also have that map out here because I realize it's a little bit difficult to see on here. But what you can do is look and say, okay, this is the proposed boundary for this type of district, and these are the existing unit types that are underneath that proposed boundary. And again, we tried to keep, or we tried to think about what was existing in each area, and then the goals that I mentioned earlier for what else. So I'm going to start and just break it down district by district to make it a little bit easier to see without all of the other colors. So this is neighborhood residential 1. For those of you online might be able to see the topography a little bit better, but there's a lot of hilliness up in this area. The roads are a little bit more narrow. The access isn't as easy. So these are really limited to the single unit dwellings and the ADUs, also the historic conversions. There's quite a lot of smaller parcels in this area as well. And these are the building types that we're talking about. So just so people can see kind of the form of the buildings, the 1 unit, the 1 to 2 unit. Obviously, with an accessory dwelling unit, you can have that within the building, but you can also have it as a detached unit. So you can see it in the back on the site, but showing a detached ADU. This is NR2, so we've traversed sort of out of the hillier area. These are a little bit smaller or a little bit larger lots in some cases. So single unit dwelling, 2 unit dwelling, historic conversion, and ADU. And these are the building types that you see here, fairly similar except for allowing the 2 unit dwellings. We also see the 2 unit dwellings could either be side by side or they could be stacked one on top of each other. Both of those exist in our areas. NR3, yes.
Can you define ADU?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I'd said, I apologize for that. I am constantly getting yelled at in my office for using acronyms, so I've just done the same thing to you. Accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, that allows you to have a smaller unit. Say you own a single unit, single family home. It allows you to have a smaller unit within that home. It is limited by size. Some communities used to have them. They used to call them in-law apartments, and you had to take down the in-law apartment when it was no longer needed. You had to take down the division. Under state law, a protected accessory dwelling unit, which is the new state law, is limited to 900 square feet or half of the square footage of the building, whichever is smaller. So it is a much smaller unit. It doesn't rise to the level of, say, a 2-unit dwelling where you would have 2 units that were could be of equal size. For example, the idea of an accessory is that you need the principal dwelling unit, and then you are allowed, because you have the principal dwelling unit, to have this smaller unit with it. There's all sorts of rules about that under state law, and as I said, we're in the process of updating that, so you'll hear from us again on it. But that is the full definition. So they are allowed in neighborhood residential 3, which you see on the screen now. You can see that this is a larger district, again, fairly responsive to what's there now, but we're very interested in hearing your thoughts on the boundaries. And then these are the buildings. So again, the 1 unit, the 2-unit dwelling, the 3-unit dwelling. Same thing, a 3-unit could be side by side, like the townhouse that you see in the lower left corner there. It could be stacked like our traditional 3-deckers. There are also 3-unit buildings out there that look like single-family homes, but they've got 3 units. There would be a different arrangement of doorways and entries at that point, historic conversion, and the accessory dwelling unit. In our urban one, or UR1, is the green that are down here in these different areas. And again, when you go back to the main map and you kind of see how the transition points happen, you'll see the different districts around it. But you can start to see that urban one, UR1, is closer to the transit stations. We've really started to move in. All of the transit stations have these walking radii around them, so they've moved in. Now, we have heard questions again about topography and existing conditions on the ground, and we're delighted to get more comments about those today. But really, as you're moving into the 2 urban residential districts, a lot of that is about where they are located near transit. You can see these, and you can see the introduction of the multiplex units. Again, just those 4 to 6 units, that smaller scale, because they're limited in unit size. And then finally, the UR2, see these within the transit areas, but because don't forget, there's also mixed use coming into the transit areas. That's going to be talked about later. You also see them clustered closer to some of the more major roads. Again, this is quite responsive to what's going on the ground in certain respects. We look quite closely at that. And then you can see here, they get from the multiplex, they get slightly larger to that residential building, but again, limited to 3 stories in height. And we took a hard look at the existing heights in the area. So I would just want to wrap up this discussion by letting you know the continued places to be heard during this. We've been working with the Planning and Permitting Committee, and of course, those are public meetings, and people are welcome to come to those. So that is sponsored. The Planning and Permitting Committee is a subset of the City Council. So in that, we have been presenting new topics, talking with them about the new topics, going back and forth on that. And then they refer the topics to the Community Development Board, which eventually has a vote on the topic to refer it back to City Council. They can make modifications at that point, and then City Council has a final vote on the topic. So all of these are public meetings. You can see these are the dates that we've been talking up until now. And then really diving into our next meeting, for example, on a new topic is West Medford Square on April 9th. We have been adding the CDB meetings here. So the April 2nd should be the residential districts. And obviously we are meeting in advance of the Community Development Board meeting. And that is because we would love to take any input. If there's any changes that, we hear from you, there's some recommendations from changes, we can take those to the Community Development Board and say, you have this from City Council, we're recommending these changes, and then there's another public discussion about that. And that's why I want to stress very much that what you're seeing today is a draft, because we can take that input and change it. We are looking at an April date for discussing the squares. We have not yet set that date. We're juggling calendars and the availability of space, but that will be there. And then we plan to have a May and a June date for some of the other topics, which we will announce. And then finally, where can I get more information? Everything we do is being put up on the city's webpage. They're completely revamped their zoning webpage. We're hoping it's easier to find that information. If you can't, please let everyone know, and we'll see what we can do to make that work. And then we're going to go to Q&A, but just again, the reminder on the maps, there's also some comment cards out there. If you have very detailed questions or comments that you want to give us, we invite you not just to say them in the room, but to write them down for us. We all read through those and take those very seriously. So thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to turn it back over for questions and comments.
I have a
question that I wanted you to answer first.
Okay.
So actually, I'm going to take the privilege of actually asking the first question because I was asked this in my office and I realized that I was not confident of the answer.
Okay.
Historic conversions, can you just talk to us what makes a building eligible for that? Does it have to be designated as a historic building to be eligible? And this is, of course, a draft, so we can change the answer, but what is the answer right now?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, I think it's 75 years was the standard that we took, but that is modifiable by community by community. Generally, when you're thinking about historic preservation, it's 75 years or more. I've seen that as being, for example, a zoning standard for demolition delay. But certainly, if there's a desire to have a different number, we can look at that. I think some communities have also thought about it in terms of the types of houses. We work throughout New England, and we'll get to some communities where they have these, especially some rural ones, where they've got those long, big, rambling farmhouses. And so, you could also talk about it as a type of historic building that you want to preserve that's important to the community. I believe it's 75 years now. Yeah,
Seven. Okay, thank you. So what we want to do is that we do have people online and we have people in the room and we need to use the mic so the people online can hear us. And frankly, because the sound in this room is not great, so we appreciate it if people use the mic. If people don't mind standing to use the mic in the room, and then Kit, you're going to just facilitate this and go back and forth. Or if there are questions online as well, people can raise their hands. For people online, you don't have the ability to chat to everybody, but if for some reason you're having specific trouble raising your hand or you can't unmute, you can send me your question and then I can read it out loud if that is a technical problem. But they can't chat to everybody. Is there anything else? Do we have other questions or comments from us first?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing, which is one I don't think I properly introduced Vice President Collins, so apologies for that. And who is chair of the Planning Permitting Committee and has really been doing some amazing work, especially on the outreach as of late. And one other thing that I think is important in grounding that we've had in a lot of these zoning conversations that I think is good to just add is changing the zoning doesn't mean that anyone who owns a piece of property has to change anything about their property. So if we change the zoning to something else and you have a single family home on a lot and suddenly you move from a SF2 district to an NR3 district, you don't have to change anything about your property. If you want to keep your single family home, you can keep your single family home. And because of this quirk of most of the zoning having passed after most of the buildings in the city were built, what would happen is that your home would become a non-conforming structure or a non-conforming use. And what that means in our zoning is actually that that's protected. There are changes that you can make to pre-existing non-conforming structures that may also be a pre-existing non-conforming use to maintain that use or maintain that structure. It doesn't mean that if you have a single family in a district that suddenly has allowed 3 families that you have to change anything about your home. So I think that's really important to understand too. This is not a mandate on anyone to do anything to their property. It is simply changing what private property owners are allowed to do with their private property. And I just think that's something that sometimes isn't included in these conversations that I think is important to talk about. So I just wanted to say that before we get started. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, we can move to Q&A. We have this here and raise your hand on Zoom and we'll alternate.
Hi, my name's Laurel Ruma. I live at 149 Burgett Avenue. And I was probably most disturbed to see that our small neighborhood, which is what I'm going to call Lower Hillside, so Boston Avenue to George Street, basically now has a bullseye on it as a urban UR1 now to be rezoned. And it's unfortunate because that word urban takes out the most important word that we all love Medford and live in this neighborhood for, which is neighborhood. And the fact that the lots in this neighborhood are very small, 3,000 square feet or less, there's maybe a handful that are more than that, means that when you live next to one of those lots, like we do, then your neighbor can put up a unit, 6 units. And I understand that this is a reason because of the green line going in. Do I ever understand that? And this is, one of those things where we had said for years, which is when the green line comes to Medford, it's going to bring all of this, great things, lots of opportunities for citizens and residents. But the toughest thing is that it's also going to put more demands on our very specific neighborhood. And this is now what we're seeing. This is the more demand part of it. And changing that small neighborhood, again, from the back of Boston Avenue, Suburgate Ave, out to George Street-ish in that kind of corridor, and then making everything else around it NR1 puts a lot more pressure on this center bullseye. And the MBTA will tell you itself that folks walk a half mile, right, to get to the green line. So the way I look at this in a more equitable fashion is what is this half mile radius around all of the T stations, including the commuter train in West Medford. To think that Wellington has the same zoning with their 15-story high-rises and everything else as our neighborhood, which is small and has maybe 200 houses at most in the very narrow streets that fire trucks can't get down because there's parking on both sides, as well as Ball Square, which has maybe 5, 6, 8-story buildings. That's where it's painful for us to see this kind of conversion and push to even UR2 to make it even more dense when we know the streets can't handle it. Streets can't handle it now. We're, as a neighborhood, largely for changing the zoning. We want more people to live in Medford. We want more people to live in our neighborhood. We also want to keep it a neighborhood. So how do we balance these two things and reduce that bullseye on our very dense, very small neighborhood? And I guess my main question is, what is the lot size rules? And what precludes developers from buying lots side by side and tearing down and building what they need to build?
You're not sharing your screen, right?
I know I'm not sharing my screen. I was not meaning to share my screen. Thank you very much. I remember comments on the same neighborhood from when we first presented this. I'm really hoping that on your way out, you stop by the map and draw the delineation, because
I've
I think
written
when we were
letters,
there,
I feel like that's plenty.
Okay, beautiful. I think when we were listening to it the first time, we weren't quite sure exactly where you want, and we wanted to make sure we got it right. So thank you for bringing that up. I did the thing that I'm not currently sharing, because I'm just going to say it, is the height limits for each of these districts, which I realize I did not tell you. I showed you the buildings and the heights, but let me tell you that the proposed height limit for NR1 and NR2 is 2.5 stories. And for NR3, UR1 and UR2 is 3 stories. There's a maximum height of 3 stories on there. So I did want to make that clear. I also do want to make clear, again, the units per lot. Under state law, accessory dwelling units are not counted in density, but so take that out. But non-ADU units, principal dwelling units, NR1, it's 1 unit. NR2, it's up to 2 units maximum. NR3, it would be 3 units maximum. UR1, 6 units maximum. And then UR2, again, there's no maximum on that one type, but it's still limited to 3 stories. So just so everybody knows that, and I apologize for not getting that earlier. In terms of parcel assembly, parcel assembly is available now to any developer who wants to buy parcels. We are looking at a smaller lot area square footage, because in most cases, the lot area, we're trying to be responsive to what's there now based on our analysis. But again, that's why we're here today, is to hear, is there an unintended consequence of the analysis that we've done? So I appreciate you bringing those comments forward.
Yeah, I think the most unintended consequence is that that neighborhood is surrounded by property that's owned by Tufts University. Mm-hmm. And that is not taken into account here. Which neighborhood has been asking for a very long time, is to create an institutional boundary to keep the limit of where Tufts can expand to out of the neighborhood, and as well as the Upper Hillside as well. So, there's absolutely, in a future, what I see.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, I guess this is just what it would be, which is, many stages of grief. But Tufts would be the primary institution that would buy up Burgett Avenue and then just turn it into the dwellings that they need it to be, whether it's housing or if it's, well, I guess it would be housing. So I guess that's always the possibility, but I just find it really frustrating when the city's largest landholder is not being held accountable in any of these zoning discussions. And when our particular neighborhood has a 10-story building at the end of it, and then 2 10-story dorms going in on Boston Ave across from it, it really starts to limit the houses that are in this neighborhood are 1- and 2-story buildings, right? So our house is a 1920s, small 1920. So we are technically historically protected, whatever that means, which is nothing. And then you would have a 6-story house next to it, right? And then you have these larger buildings built by Tufts surrounding everything. So unlike Wellington, where you have like a diversity possibility of different buildings, different heights, different uses, just a different place to be. I mean, Wellington's exciting because anything is possible. There's very little that's possible in our bullseye. It's Tufts University or our tiny little, what is now a neighborhood. So that's the unintended consequence for us, which is really just reiterating that Tufts has to be part of this conversation, and they have to be somehow bounded so the rest of the neighborhoods don't feel this pain. And I guess my other thought is, if you're going to make this tiny little bullseye UR 1 or 2, expanding that out to the entire neighborhood that benefits from the Green Line extension, which is half a mile radius at the very least, is more fair.
Okay, thank you.
Emily, just on the map, is the light gray is that a quarter mile radius, and then
I think it's a 1/4.5. Yeah.
okay, and then the half mile goes out further. Yeah, we are definitely talking about Tufts and institutional zoning. It is something that we're taking up in April, I believe.
It's April, yeah.
And we want to put in the Tufts institutional zone and whatever power is in our disposal to control Tufts, which is there's more that we can do, but it is also limited. And I think we've had some honest discussions on the planning and permitting committee around, should this be an NR3 like the rest of everything? Should it be a UR1? We've definitely heard some comments around the NR3 instead of the UR1 because a lot of the existing condition is very similar to the neighborhood outside of it. And then we've heard the flip side, which is, if you're within the 1/4 mile radius of like one of our only 3 rapid transit stations, what should you do around density there? So I think, hearing more of those comments, maybe pulling back the UR1 to a smaller piece of that area might make sense. Maybe going to NR3 would make sense. I'm interested to hear what the Community Development Board input through public input is on that as well. But in terms of comparison to Wellington, the area immediately around the Wellington station for transit is going to be part of a special district where it already is part of an overlay district that has high density and likely is going to have a mixed use district with very high density. So we are intending that the Wellington T station, certainly the 1/4 mile radius and into the half mile radius, would look much denser than the UR1 district around the Medford Tufts station. And that's because of what's there now. We have 2 hands on Zoom. Do you want to go to Andrew?
Go to Andrew and then back to the podium and then go to the next person on Zoom.
Okay, Andrew, you can request to unmute.
Go back.
Hi there, Andrew Van Horn, Medford resident. Thanks for taking my question. 2 quick questions. I'm not sure if you've addressed either of these, so if you have, I apologize. How many total units, or have you considered how many total units this could add citywide? Additionally, are there any affordable housing requirements built into the plan?
Boom.
think it's a question for you.
They've just assigned that to me, Andrew. Thank you very much for the question. So we have not done a build out analysis, and there's a couple of reasons. But one is when you're looking at something like this, whether or not a unit is built is up to the property owner, right? So if you're living in a single unit dwelling, say, and you've just been changed to neighborhood residential 2, and now you can have a 2-unit dwelling. Maybe your existing zoning district didn't allow that 2-unit dwelling before, but now it's an option. You as the property owner have the right to exercise that option. And that's what Council President Bears alluded to earlier, is that nobody's forced to make a change. And so to have some sort of accurate assessment of how many units could change over time, it would be a snapshot picture with a lot of additional factors that don't go into a build out analysis of that type. So for example, not only do you have to factor in whether or not somebody chooses to change their property, but you also have to think about, well, what are the economic conditions now? So what are the things that go into whether or not something is built? So it's, first of all, do I exercise that option? Can I get the financing? Can I get the materials? Certainly, for example, during the pandemic, we saw the shoot up in construction prices and the commodities prices. And in many ways, that inflationary environment has not changed much. Interest rates are higher. Labor is difficult to get. So it's not that development's not done. It's just, it's hard to say, we could maybe make this calculation, but it wouldn't necessarily have any meaning. So I think that's part of it. Second part of the question. Affordable housing. Yes. So on this, the city does have affordable housing, or it's also called inclusionary zoning requirements that apply citywide. We haven't added additional ones on this. For the mixed use areas, there are some incentive, what we call incentive zoning, where there is additional height in exchange for public benefits, and that includes some choices around affordable housing that has not currently been applied to these districts. So, but interested obviously in any comments on that.
Yeah, and I would just add on inclusionary zoning, right now the city's inclusionary zoning kicks it into 10-unit building. We are trying to get the funding to do the Nexus study to update our affordable housing linkage fees and the inclusionary zoning ordinance. One barrier that we have now is that the Supreme Court has said that things like linkage fees and potentially inclusionary zoning can be defined as illegal takings by the government, essentially requiring financial taking from a private property owner. So in order for our linkage fees and our inclusionary zoning to be legally defensible and unchallengeable, we have to do market analysis to determine what the market can bear. And if we say you have to have 50% affordable in order to build this thing on your property, the landowner can challenge that, call that a taking, and then basically just what our inclusionary zoning ordinance would become invalid. They may not have to build any affordable housing at all. So it's another barrier that's been added to this kind of regulation. It's very frustrating, but we are hoping, at least my hope is that we can do an analysis and maybe reduce the place at which the units start. So maybe take that down from a 10-unit to a 6-unit. Another thing that we can update with our inclusionary zoning, and this is part of the ongoing part of this larger project, is to include fractional affordable housing, which essentially means, let's say we required essentially that if the number of required units ended up being 7.5, or let's say 0.5, for example, for a very like a 6-unit development, instead of either just getting one or no affordable units, the developer would pay a cash payment into our affordable housing trust fund, and that could be used to support affordable housing at another private location. So those are some of the things we're looking at, but the inclusionary is a discussion we're having, I think, in May.
Yeah. And so as it stands now, as your regulations stand now, it would only apply in the urban residential 2, where you could have more than 6 units, but it would not apply in the others because they're below 6 or 6 or below units. So they don't meet the 10-unit threshold.
Another option we could look at is in the mixed-use corridors and squares, we developed this incentive zoning program. So if someone adds affordable units, they can build another story. I don't know if we want to do that. If there may be in the UR2, we want to add an incentive zoning so you could go up to a 4th story. But I think we're starting, you're balancing a lot of concerns there. So we didn't take that route, at least in the initial proposal.
I can't hardly stand this. Hi, y'all. I still have some PTSD from Tufts. I'm Lori Krieger, 124 Brookings Street. And my first question, when you talk about affordable housing, is that defined as rentals or is that defined as for purchase? And then I'll tell a story.
So why don't so affordable housing could be rental or purchase. To be clear, it's a restriction that goes on the deed, and it talks about the income that the person must have in order to get that. And then so there's both an income level for the person who is getting the unit. The unit has to be lotteried off because we require it to be, there are a lot of state regulations around, we call these deed restricted affordable units. Doesn't mean that they're just cheap. It means there are restrictions on it. So you must be under a certain income. And then the rent or the sale price is set through formulas that are governed by the state. And if you're in a deed restricted affordable unit and you are renting, then in order for them to raise your rent, they actually have to go through a process with the city every year where we approve the rent increases. And there are certain parameters, like we have to approve a certain amount, but we can't, like, we don't let them go over a certain, right? So like there are parameters that we have to work within. So it could be either. And if you purchase a deed restricted affordable unit, there are restrictions on the resale of that too. Cool. So those can be kind of controversial because it limits how much you can make when you sell that.
Right.
But you're never, if you live there for a long time, you're never paying rent to anybody. You own it.
Okay, now I have a story to tell you, and I'm hoping that, like, I haven't been following along because I got exhausted with the Tufts thing, and now here I am, I'm back. And so I'm from a household that had a single mom for a family, and by the time I was 30, I lived in 20 different residences. So that was really important. I finally landed rent control in Cambridge, and got to stay there a few years, and then they voted out rent control, and I couldn't afford Cambridge, I couldn't afford Somerville, and I could afford Brookings Street in Medford. What a blessing. It was affordable for us then, barely, right? So we could buy a house, we never even knew we could buy a house. So it's the first house I've ever lived in that was owned by someone in my family. My mom's come from another country. So what's really important to me is when we bought the house, this is what I want to really, really share with you. Couple things. We could just barely afford buying the house 27 years ago, but because we bought the house and eventually refinanced the house and stuff like that, it stabilized the income, which stabilized my life, which allowed me to get really better jobs again and again until, like, I couldn't even afford to buy my own house now, but that stabilization was huge. And so when I look around me and I see all these developments that are happening, either for homes or for luxury apartments or whatever, it seems to be like a 28 to 30% vacancy rate, or just buildings that have been built, they're just empty. So for me, I developed my family wealth now because we had a stable, what I still call rent, right? Even though we own the house. So whatever you can do to allow people to get in at the rate they can afford, but allow them to develop and accrue wealth so that they can give it to their children or whoever's next in the family line, because that's what creates community also. We just did a wonderful thing in our community because we were stable and we were a neighborhood. And if these new buildings are built, there are developers come in, Tufts comes in and builds 6 family places, and they're all rental. How do we create the community that still supports this Medford, city of Medford, in a viable, bright, engaged way. Like, we're phenomenal neighborhood, so please love us good. The other thing that I wanted to think about, so really worry about vacancies and worry generational wealth. Let's help people build generational wealth however we can and create neighborhoods. The other thing that's really important, that's really strange, when I bought the house, the building department, it said it was built in 1927. And that sounds right, because everything on Charnwood is historic commuter bungalows. And they have historical information about them. When I pulled the permit 12 years later, 15 years later, to reside the house, it said 1944 was when my house was built. So something was changed in the paperwork that I had nothing to do with, and I never argued with it because I never had a need to. Now, in terms of what's historical or what's not historical, that might be important. And one thing that's really strange, I don't know why it was changed, and it looks like more than just my home was changed to 1944. That was well into World War II. I don't think they were building a lot of houses well into World War II. And I don't know how to do anything with that, but please be mindful that these old documents may not be quite correct. And please be mindful that is a historic neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. And we can definitely, on the side, work with the assessor, just to try to figure out what changed on your paperwork. And I'm sure that the Historical Commission might have some documentation as well, and we could bring that to the assessor just to change it back or get it right. Either way, you'd fall under I guess we wrote it as 70, but I think we meant 75. Right now, the historical ordinance for demolition delay is 75 years. I think we wanted the historical conversion to match that, so that might just be, so you're good either way. But, and quite frankly, most 1, 2, and 3 family housing in the city was built before 1950. So it would fall under it falls under demo delay. If there's the Historical Commission, if someone wanted to demolish a property that age, not saying that you would want to do that, but that's one of the reasons that we wanted to match those. I think a couple things that you said really brought out some of the points as to why we're trying to do what we're trying to do. And some of it is difficult. And I think that's just something we've been trying to acknowledge throughout the process. Change is never easy. The first thing is, I appreciate you saying it. One of the things that I've heard that I've really liked, because I think it makes a really important point, is that the 30-year fixed rate mortgage is rent control for homeowners. And that's why, it provides you that stability, where you don't have to worry about being priced out and constantly moving. And that's why I think it's important to note that zoning is one piece of a number of strategies that we're trying to either employ because we have the power to, or get the state to give us the power to employ. This is the one that's about, we control zoning so we can control what legally can be built on property, essentially the supply question. Another piece of the housing cost issue is that demand. There's a lot more people want to live in Medford than we have houses for, so that's why the prices are skyrocketing so quickly. And one of the other things that we try to do to answer that is subsidizing the price. So Section 8 or the RAFT assistance program at the state level. So that's like trying to subsidize the price. It doesn't really solve the problem, but it does help some people. The flip side of that is like a rent stabilization or a rent control, where you say the price can only go up this far, but it also doesn't solve the long-term problem, which is more people want to live here than we have houses for. So I think what we're trying to do here is say, 30 years ago, when you were moving from Cambridge and Somerville was not affordable, but Medford was, that radius has expanded, right? That radius, you could say, goes out to 95, maybe 495 now. And the question is, how do we have more units that people can either rent or buy in Medford, where we can try to keep the price reasonable and try to keep the prices stable for as long as we can. Yeah, and people like my parents, we couldn't buy the house. My parents couldn't buy the house that they live in today. They only bought it 30 years ago because it was the price that it was then. I can't buy a house in the city right now. And I think that's true of a lot of people. We are a 55% homeowner, 45% renter city, and a lot of people who rent want to stay. And I just in the discussions we're having, folks around Salem Street, I got an email from someone who lives right off of Salem Street who says, I've lived here for 5 years. They're selling my house. I have to move to outside of Waltham, the back end of Waltham out by 95. But I'd love to stay in Medford. And, really what we're trying to do, and this is a piece of that strategy, is how can we get more units in the city so that people can afford to live here? If some of them are for sale, essentially, I think someone had a great analogy. If we do nothing, if we just status quo, we have the number of units we have and we don't do anything, the prices are just going to keep going up. And if you own, you're going to be okay because, well, maybe not, but most people are going to be okay if they can afford to pay their mortgage and their taxes, right? But new people aren't going to be able to move here. And a lot of people are eventually going to have to end up selling for some reason, retirement or something else. And the prices are just going to keep going up. So we're not going to have the generational wealth opportunities. We're not going to have the ability for the children of people who live here now to try to buy another unit in the city unless they somehow are, making $200,000 or $300,000 a year, which most people don't. And one of the other pieces of that question is also just household size. The average household size is declining. So if you have a lot of larger homes where you may have had a family of 4, a family of 6, that is now just 1 or 2 people, you would essentially need to have 3, like a triple decker on that property to have just the same density that you had maybe 30 years ago or 40 years ago. So that's why we believe that the densification here is important. It helps create not just this deed restricted affordable housing, which has legal limits and you can't force people to build more of it than the market can bear, but to try to build more housing so that existing housing stock maybe goes down in price so that we can try to better match supply and demand with the conditions that we face today.
Thank you, Ted. The two things, the generational wealth is so important, especially for kids like us, right? And then the other thing is that developers don't end up leaving some of them building down.
Yeah, and
I've seen that in Cambridge and some of the home.
And I think, that's another reason. Right now, what we're seeing is that the land is so valuable that someone can build a giant single-family home and leave it empty for years and still make a profit. And
even 2 deckers and 6 units.
Yeah. And I think the bet we're trying to say is if we can, get them to build smaller units, more affordable units, not just these luxury units, by allowing more density in the same place than exists now, it could help reduce the vacancy. Part of the problem is we can't control what they do. So, but we're trying to essentially adjust the market balance here to be more a priority of like what actual people need, and less of these things that people can't afford. But there's a regional question. And even if we did all of this tomorrow, I don't think we're going to solve the whole problem, but I think we're moving in the right direction.
And I'll just add to that. It's a powerful story that you gave, and thank you for that. Zoning is an imperfect tool for some of these problems. So it can get you so far. It can require the subsidized affordable housing under certain circumstances. It can create that affordability or allow for the possibility of that affordable by design, those smaller units on smaller lots or multiple units on smaller lots. Zoning doesn't speak to ownership. It's a comment I get quite a lot is, oh, can you zone for condominiums? Can you zone for rental? You can't do that through zoning. You can zone for different types of houses. I like to think of if you think of somebody in their entire lifespan, they grow up, they get into the working world, they have education, different stages of their life. They may have families of various size. They may downsize from that. However they do that, there's a need to have a diversity of housing types to address people at all stages of their life cycle. So one of the things that zoning can do is create the conditions by being permissive about allowing for that diversity of housing types, but it can't force them to be built. And I think that's something to remember. I've had people get very frustrated because they're like, well, we changed the zoning 2 years ago. Why hasn't this been built? It's because zoning doesn't require it to be built. It just gives the options, it gives the permissions, it puts the limitations on things. And what we're trying to do is get those conditions right for going forward.
I do want to note that we've been here an hour and 20 minutes and we've taken 3 questions, so we may need to keep our answers a little shorter.
Sorry about that.
It's not about the questions, it's about the answers. So why don't we go to the CF online?
Go to CF online and go to the podium. I'm asking you to unmute.
Hello, my name's
We can
Christian.
hear you.
I live at 386 Fellsway West. Just a couple of questions. Do we know when this process is expected to go into like the final approval? And then assuming that it does go into effect, what would be the process for converting from one type to another type, like to add a unit or something like that?
I can answer that, and I'll try to be brief. There's going to be a Community Development Board public hearing on April 2nd. They may conclude their hearing at that meeting, and they may extend it to their next meeting. Once that's reported out, it would come back to the City Council for a public hearing. The earliest we would consider that would be April 16th. It may be extended beyond that. And that City Council public hearing would be the final approval. So at the earliest, it would be April 16th after the upcoming 2 public hearings. And in terms of if there is new zoning, how would you build something under it? You would go to the building department and you would request a building permit, and they will tell you whether or not your permit meets the conditions of the zoning. And if not, then there might be another process that you might have to go through, like a special permit or something else.
Thank you.
Back to the podium. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cecilia Karlowitz, 41 Burbank Road. First, just want to say thanks for doing all this. Really appreciate all the work that's gone into this, the thoughtfulness. My husband and I moved to Medford less than a year ago. We specifically chose Medford for its diversity, its proximity to the city. And, you know, I was thrilled first and foremost for the ADU state law. Like, I would love someday to turn my 2-car garage that's just full of junk right now into an ADU and have my parents come live and ultimately have multi-generational living together in our single family house. That's the dream. I know it can be realized here in Medford. Thank you. I mostly want to ask about what was the term that you used? The like percentage of the lot sizes that can be taken up with these changes in zoning. And maybe that's not part of this. Maybe the like setbacks and percentage of the lots that a building can occupy is already in stone and is not going to change. But something I really like about walking around my neighborhood is the amount of green space. And so I would hate, you know, I don't mind if the house next to me is, you know, I would mind a little bit, but if in the interest of growth and, you know, sharing our land with those who also want to live here, I wouldn't mind if it was turned into a 2-unit built dwelling, but I would mind if it took up 90% of the lot. I currently live in a zone that would be upzoned to NR2.
I've pulled up my table of dimensional standards. So we're currently looking at building coverage maximums of 50% for all of the neighborhood residential and 60% for the urban residential. Again, it's a draft. We also think green space is important. There is a pervious surface requirement of 30% for the neighborhood residential, 25% for the urban residential, and there's an open space minimum requirement of 20% of the lot for neighborhood residential and 15% for urban residential. So, you know, open to hearing some more thoughts on that. We agree that having the units, having more space between them, having that green space, and certainly with the city's priorities for addressing climate change and sustainability, that's important. These would obviously change if these were the mixed use areas change a little bit more, depending on that. For example, Mystic Avenue is much more coverage, but they also have to do other things in order to offset that. So.
Okay, yeah. Is this online somewhere that I can dig into a little bit more? I apologize. I came up and asked the
Yeah,
question
no worries. That's
naively.
online now.
I can check.
If it's not, Kit or I will request it to be, and I can tell you that the short URL is medfordma.org/zoning.
So I'm on that like every day.
And I would like to, I think when you do your math, it's confusing to people who don't know what these words all mean. Can you explain how the building coverage max can be 50%, but the open space minimum is 20%? Why isn't that 50%?
Right, exactly. So then we've got the pervious surface. So pervious surface, thank you. I love the fact that Alicia is calling me out on this because we rattle these terms off all the time and we don't think about it. Pervious means that water can soak through it. So generally when you get a paved area, so for say, parking, it's asphalt, the water runs off, it creates flooding either in the street or sometimes on a neighbor's property. We don't want to allow that. So if you think of a lot and you've set across the setbacks and you get a building envelope, that's the area in which a building can be built. So you take the total lot, 50% of it, no more than 50% of it can be the building, but you still have to have driveway, parking, and all of that. So the pervious surface, there's a restriction on how much can be impervious with water runoff and how much can be pervious with the water soaking in. And then the open space is a minimum requirement. So you can't go below 20% rather than a maximum requirement. So we would love it if you have more open space, but you at least can't go below 20% on that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. I would love more transparency or just like easier access to that information. I think that will, I don't know, alleviate some fears maybe a little bit. I tend to think that what it feels like when you walk around in residential areas where it's single family zoned currently, the green space matters more than how many people are actually living in that building. So thank you very much for the answer. Appreciate it. Thanks.
We will go to Louise on Zoom. You got it.
Yeah, hi, this is Mark Davidson. This is my wife's computer, 63 West Street. I know we had a discussion last night about ADUs, although I'm interested in hearing that Emily had brought up a number of ADU issues, and Council President Bayers also talked about the fact that there are so many single-family homes that have only 2 occupants. Historically, they'd been larger families, and the schematics that were shown earlier in this meeting showed detached ADUs or first floor ADUs, and there hasn't, as far as I know, been a lot of discussion yet on second and third floor ADUs. I understand that there's egress issues associated with that, but I'd like to see if there are some changes in the works for accommodating ADUs that are within the building on the second or third floor of some of the older homes in Medford. I appreciate your comments on that. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your comments. If the diagrams in any way sought to or looked like they were restricting the position of ADUs within the existing building, I apologize. That was not the intent. We were just showing those sort of wireframed out to say that there was a principal building and you could have a detached. As far as I remember from what we've worked on, there's no restrictions on where the ADU would be within that existing dwelling. So I hope that alleviates the concerns. As I said, we're looking forward to bringing the full draft in later, but no, there's no restriction that I know of on those at this point.
Yeah, one thing that's changing, and it's partly because of the state law, right now from the recodification, an attached ADU can be done by right. but a detached ADU requires a special permit. This will move both to a by right status, which is one change. One thing we do need to look at when you mention egress is I think we actually have to talk about building code.
Right.
It may require a second form of egress, but this is where it differs from a second principal unit on the same lot. I don't think it needs a second door. I don't think you have to have two separate doors outside of the building. Not 100% sure on that, but I think that might be a building code thing, not a zoning thing. And,
Correct.
And we could look at that. And that's the state building code that we function under.
Yep. Okay, Cheryl?
Hi, Cheryl Rodriguez, 281 Park Street, home of the density without the transit. And much more is coming to us thanks to this zoning. The neighborhood residential one, based on what the city council and the consultants have said they are interested in, the neighborhood one zone shouldn't exist if you want to add more density, especially since these areas will change so much more slowly than the neighborhood three zones. So there's really no need to preserve a zone that only allows single families for decades to come. If density is good for the community, then why are the densest areas allowing the most density on the smallest lots of only 3K, while those with lots 40% larger or more will have very low density and are being zoned to maintain the least density with 5,000 square foot minimum by allowing only single family homes with the state required ADU? Those areas should take more density to give those of us already dense some breathing room. We too have neighborhood character. We too would like to be considered. It is not logical to say that it's because you can't add housing when you're saying you could, or parking, when you're saying you can put 3 family homes on 3K lots with parking. There should be a minimum 2 family allowed on every residential lot in the city, and the ADU, as you said, does not count towards that. Especially since some of those lots limited to 1 or 2 units are within the transit circles, while Glenwood may one day get a bus that will take us to the areas with transit and remain less dense than us while also enjoying that transit. With the exception of the one ring of UR1 near Tufts, we find ourselves more or equally dense to those with easy transit access. In addition to the 140-lot Salem Street corridor that just passed, Glenwood has a very predatory flipper in our neighborhood who is making so much money in our neighborhood alone that he opened a storefront on Salem Street so he doesn't have to travel far to go to work, along with owning 4 other Salem Street parcels where he can now build 6 floors on his slightly over 3,000 square foot lots. So we will see lots of change. It will not take decades for our area to be transformed. This is a guarantee. So we hope that perhaps the neighborhoods where this will happen much more slowly can at least take some of the weight. Please acknowledge that we are a neighborhood, that we do have character, that we do live here, that we like to breathe. We like oxygen. We like trees. So maybe you could have considered that, but I realize this is already past the Community Development Board, and after the treatment the Salem Street corridor got, with the suggestions being wiped away with a single motion by Matt Lemming, my neighborhood is not holding out much hope. We are very disheartened that we are being dismissed in favor of pushing your density in our area and not others. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments on the Neighborhood 1 district. That's the first time, I think, in this group that we've heard the idea of adding more density to that. So obviously, we'll take that into consideration with the others. And then, as you say, the Salem has already passed. But I will just note that as we are going through all of the districts, so we're taking them geographically and also topically, one of the things that we've talked about at the city with the city is that as we finish up all of the districts, We do need to go back and see if there are any changes that need to be made. We're learning as we touch each new geography, we're learning more. And so there will be a kind of cleanup at the end. And so some of the things that we've looked at in the past may change. It's one of the reasons that I'm hoping those of you who are here in the room and maybe those of you who are online can email to the planning department if there's any specific neighborhoods or anything specific parcels where you see for the neighborhood boundaries, and then later we would get to the mixed use where we've shown it one way and it should be another. Please do let us know what's very important. Thank you again for your comments.
Yeah, I just want to add to that when we talk about this citywide rezoning, we are talking about densification in all districts and all neighborhoods. I certainly could be amenable to the argument that the NR1 district should be an NR2 district. I'm not against that. I think where we came in with this proposal was looking at existing structures, what's already there, the number of private ways, topography, and, you know, the NR1 lot size. I mean, so we're reducing lot size minimums. Excuse me, thank you. We're reducing lot size minimums. We are reducing setbacks. We're increasing maximum coverage, even in the NR1. There are lots up there right now in the SF1. It's a 7,000 lot size minimum. So that's the most, that is the biggest lot size minimum in the whole city. So the NR1 does increase density in those NR1 districts.
No.
Yes, it does.
I'm sorry, but
I'm sorry.
they said this would be
I'm
a
sorry.
conversation, so I'm just going to
I'm sorry, I
interrupt
haven't
you.
finished it. So if I didn't interrupt you, so if you could not
you're trying to
interrupt
correct me, and you're incorrect.
if you could just let me finish.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought this was community input.
I think it is.
It's not community
Is it a
input?
conversation or community input, or is it yell at me day? You let me
I'm
know.
not yelling at you. I'm speaking into a microphone.
Is it interrupt me time? Because I let you have your piece, and
Okay.
I'd like to have my piece.
So
and
you're
then I
not
can-
increasing density in the NR1
Yes.
zone because it's still
Okay.
only allowing
All
the
right.
same amount of housing. The lots are not going to be PARs. It
Guess
will be
I'm
the
not allowed to
exact
talk.
same
Sorry
amount
about
of
that.
housing because it's 5,000 square foot minimum. So if they have a 7,000 square foot lot, they can still only put a single family home. In the NR3, and maybe this is confusing for you, in the
not
NR3,
confused.
you only need a 3,000 square foot lot to put 3 families. Currently, you need more than that to put a single, and even more than that to put a 2. So we're going down to 3. We have lots of 3,000 square foot lots. There will be lots of density added to our area, which you saw in the map that showed the current conditions, because Nelson has been buying lots and doubling the housing on them and selling them for $1 million plus each. So please,
Can I finish?
please be
Can
honest
I
when you
finish?
speak. If you can be honest, that would be
Oh,
great.
I'm
Because I can go
being
toe to toe with you on the zoning because I've read it. I've read it.
Yeah.
I've read it.
So we're trying to have a discussion, conversation.
Have it.
I don't think throwing
Then I can
around
interrupt you.
accusations of dishonesty and interrupting me is going to help us to do that.
So you can't counter anything that I've said.
Well, I already was, but you interrupted me, so.
No, you just said there'll be single-family homes on 5,000 square foot lots.
All right. You know, if it's not worth
He's
it.
not
I-
answering.
If anyone else wants to discuss this issue with me, I'm happy to discuss it with you. If anyone wants to ask a reasonable question and have a dialogue with me, I'm happy to have it, but I'm not sure what you're, I,
Said she didn't know. But 4 units is more than 1.
yeah, I'm not disputing that.
Okay, well, yes, you are.
I'm not. My point being, if I could finish my point, was that this plan is about increasing density in every part of the city. Every district proposed generally does that. And if you look at the existing conditions map, that is one of the reasons that districts were drawn the way they were drawn. Thank you. It reduces lot size minimums, reduces setbacks.
It actually didn't. We might. So one of the things that we need to look at, and the kind of feedback that is very useful, is what do people think of the ones that are proposed? We're looking at, so part of the NR1 zone right now has 7,000 square feet minimums, and some has 5,000. The current proposal on the table is 5,000. If you or any others would like to respectfully propose suggestions, like you'd like to see it be smaller, like 4,000 or 3,000, we're happy to hear that. It is extraordinarily hard to hear accusations when we're trying to, we'd love your suggestions and we'd like to know how it impacts you in your neighborhood. We'd love to hear that. That is very helpful. So I would like to move on to the next person. So we do have one more online.
Hi, this is Chris Dagg, also on my wife's Zoom. I just had a follow-up question from a few questions back, where you guys mentioned that the earliest possible would be for like approval was, I believe, April 16th. So does that mean that, my neighbor or developer on April 17th can go and get a permit and then, it would start building as soon as the permit's approved?
So I'll actually offer some clarifications. Zoning is very interesting. And actually, I have a mild correction, but the city council public hearing is advertised for April 29th. So the earliest is April 29th that it could be passed. It can't be passed before then, and it may or may not, like they could choose to table it. The way zoning works is that usually people are afraid that people will hear that we're discussing a zoning change, and usually the first time they'll hear about it is when it's publicly advertised. And so then they'll try and slip something in and get a building permit before the zoning is actually changed. So the law is actually designed to prevent that, which actually means that the zoning is retroactive to the date that it is first advertised to prevent this sort of like slipping things in. So what actually means, so this has been advertised.
Yeah.
So the date that this has been advertised, if it is passed the way it was advertised, is the date that they could apply for building permits. There's a weird limbo window between it's been advertised but not passed, and the building department is going to do their best to not approve any building permits during that window because they don't actually know what will exactly be passed. But you could apply right now under this new zoning code. But what I'm saying is you wouldn't get your permit until the code is passed.
And then presumably if what was advertised changes as a result of this meeting or the Community Development Board hearing, or indeed the City Council's approval, a developer who has filed that permit runs the risk of the rules actually changing on them, right? Because we could reduce the lot size minimum or increase it for that matter, and their permit would therefore not be valid.
Right.
Okay. Just checking.
Sorry, that's very technical in the weeds. Should we go to sorry, I took your job. I can't help myself.
Hi, I'm Judy Weinstock at 144 Burgett. Thank you for this meeting. It's really appreciated. So just a couple of things, and some of you have already heard from me on this. I'm in what would become UR1, I think. Right. And I stand with Laurel in terms of it hadn't actually occurred to me around the idea of expanding the UR1 in an effort to not drive so much potential developer activity to one very small area. Interesting idea. But I will say that I feel fairly certain that density, which I will tell you is a word I don't actually like because it's completely undefined. It is not a quantitative measure. It is a qualitative measure. One day maybe you'll measure it, but you're not measuring it now. And you can't predict what it will be as a result of these changes. I will say that the UR1, I think the part of it that bothers me living in that as opposed to an NR3 is the idea of developers coming in and buying multiple lots and then erecting buildings, which actually does drive up the cost because developers will pay more for lots than an average buyer will because they know there's good money in it if they can sell 6 lots on what had otherwise been a 2-family home. And they will make a lot of money at it. So I would caution UR1 at all in neighborhoods where my lot size is 4,000 square feet. Most of my neighbors, it's 4,000 square feet or less. So I think that the multiplex idea is the one that actually disturbs me the most in the UR1 classification because it's the one that invites developers in. And it's the one that will actually drive up cost in the neighborhood overall. Not talking about per unit pricing, I'm talking about overall land pricing. right, which drives housing prices. So that's number one. I would implore you to really consider, you either expand UR1 and take out the option of 4 to 6 multiplex, which you could do, and maybe that just is then defined as an NR3. I don't know. Yeah. But I do think that will be the developer-driven activity in any of the neighborhoods that are designated as URs, because developers will come in and they'll do that work really efficiently. The other thing that I would like to do is ask if perhaps it's Alicia, I'm not sure, can define what can be done in a single-family home like mine that actually is considered historic, but may actually fall down someday, right? Even though it's designated as historic, even historic homes sometimes need to be destroyed. What will an individual homeowner still be able to do? I've asked this question at another meeting where I felt like maybe I totally misunderstood the exclusion of new single-family home builds. So I think that I heard, maybe I'm wrong, that if there's an empty lot or an empty home that gets bought, an entirely empty lot, that you wouldn't permit single-family homes on that lot under UR1, but that if I wanted to raise my house, which by the way I don't, if I wanted to raise it because it's decrepit and falling apart, hasn't burned to the ground, no catastrophic flooding, would I be able to rebuild a single-family home on my lot, since I currently own it? So I think those are my two clarifications that I need on what the single-family home exclusion means under UR1, and also would argue that multiplexes are going to do exactly the opposite of what you hope.
Well, thank you. We appreciate the thoughts on the multiplex. It's really helpful to hear the concerns with that. So the idea is that there are uses, and when you have a use, if that use is an existing use, you can continue that use. So you could take, and I have to tell you, in our experience in the city of Medford, we've not dealt with this in residential before, but we see it not infrequently for storefronts and businesses like that, right? That it's a use that's not allowed at that location, but it exists, and somebody else comes in and wants to continue that use at that location, and that is allowed. So you can sell your single family house, you can renovate your single family house, and if you want to tear it down and put it back, you can. But if you tear it down and leave the property vacant for 2 or more years, then you have lost the right to do that. So it's this continuous use, and having it not be that there was a lot of controversy over the word abandoned, but abandoned is literally in our zoning, and that is when you don't use it for multiple years. So if that house was vacant for many years, we might then actually have an argument over it. And the example we were using is a gas station that was vacant for 10 years. And they said, well, I still have the right because the gas station still exists. And we said, no, you've let that use lapse. So there would be an argument that if the single family house was allowed to stand vacant for 2 or more years, that it would lose the use and the protection.
What if I sold it to Mike?
He could do it, but as long as you didn't have this vacancy for more than 2 years, where the under construction doesn't count, right? So you have the house, the property, you move out. It takes him a year to pull his building permit and start construction, and 2 years to finish. That's fine. It was the year before he pulled the building permit. And once he had it, I will say though, I'm not an expert on building permit rules. There are limits to how long they're good for, and I can't speak to that off the top of my head. They do eventually hit limits, and you have to say here's why it's taking so long, and I need extensions. We've literally seen people pull a building permit and then do nothing for years. That's not okay. Those expire. There are rules around that. But
I think that's a lot of good clarity about what single family homeowners will still be permitted to do under certain circumstances that aren't just catastrophic circumstances.
Right.
And I think just to add to it, we also have something let's say we did a UR1, but you wanted to expand your single family that's now a pre-existing non-conforming use and structure, I think you can go up to 150% of the status that it was before. So you could still even add an addition to a single family, even under the UR1, but there would be some limitations.
Thank you.
We're going to Ren Bean on Zoom.
Yeah, hi, Ren Bean, 37 Woodrow Avenue. I just wanted to attempt to agree with some things I heard earlier, which I was a little surprised with, but and add to the idea that I think the NR1 lot minimum should come down to 4,000. To me, it doesn't seem particularly logical that zoning would allow buildings with more units on a smaller parcel. I think if that's big enough for two, it should be big enough for one. I don't see any reason to pose that restriction personally. And I think there even could be an argument for just kind of anything that's NR1, just make it NR2. I think the city may get more mileage out of allowing lots that are currently single families to become, double family units, whether it's 2-decker or, split in a kind of a different configuration, non-historical conversion. It's just given the number of lots that fall under that category. I heard the thing about topography and narrow roads, but I'll tell you, I live in an area that is a lot of 2-family units, single family units, a couple mixed in. It's that little slice that's going to be an NR3 on the west side of 93 there near Medford Square. And the vibe of the neighborhood is not that different than the rest of Lawrence Estates, which is, going to be left as NR1 on the northern part. I just don't see any real reason for that. Some people may feel strongly that they want to preserve the neighborhood character, but I would say come walk around the neighborhoods with 2-family units. They really don't feel that different. And that may add more to our housing stock over the broad swath of land that it covers. I hear the piece about narrow streets, but most of the units that are there have driveways and curb parking that could accommodate even the parking minimums that we have, which even if left in place, I think the city could probably absorb that personally. But at the very least, I think the very large lots on the north side of West Medford that are being left as NR1 should definitely be NR2. They have plenty of space. I happen to agree with that comment particularly. It may not be as near transit, but we certainly want to encourage transit-oriented development. The reality is a lot of the pressures in the housing market are commuters to Boston, and that's just not really going to change anytime soon. So we may as well allow the build to occur where the market will drive it. And I agree with the general sentiment that will help us closely match supply with demand. So, and one last question for the single-family owners that end up getting zoned into a unit, a zoning where single family is a now non-conforming use. I think I understood the answer where if you wanted to basically build the same, tear down and rebuild the same structure that you have. But if someone were to pull a permit for an addition, let's say they wanted to add another bedroom or, something to make space for grandparents or something that want to live in the house. It's not an accessory dwelling unit. Would they have to go through the Zoning Board of Appeals now? And should the city consider maybe adding some kind of grandfather clause for those people, to skip that part of the process? Because that can be cumbersome. And I don't imagine the ZBA really, they'd probably stamp them all if I had to guess, but that's going to clog up the works potentially. So that's just a thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments on the NR1 and your thoughts around that. Really appreciate. Again, this is exactly the sort of input that we're looking for, is these comments and questions. I am delighted to say that the city already has some language around non-conforming single and 2-family residential structures, and I thought it might come up, so I've got it in front of me. It's section 94-5.5, and it says that non-conforming, there's a lot of it, but the one I'm going to read to you now is non-conforming single and 2-family residential structures may be reconstructed, extended, altered or structurally changed upon a determination by the building commissioner, so not the zoning board of appeals, that such proposed reconstruction, extension, alteration, or change does not increase the non-conforming nature of said structure and adds not more than 100% to its gross floor area. And then there's a definition of what those permissible changes are, and then language that basically says that the building commissioner says you don't meet those conditions, then it would have to go to the Board of Appeals. So there is already some language in there. We've talked about whether or not that gets expanded, maybe to a 3-family unit as well. But for the moment, there is that provision in there now.
And for those online, I just dropped a link to that ordinance in there. And I did actually just want to comment that when people have a chance to see these maps again that have the existing conditions, what most people in Medford don't realize that if you walk up Forest Street from Medford Square away from Medford Square towards the Rotary, most of those buildings on your right are at least 2-family houses, if not more dense than that. And the ones on your left are almost all single-family houses. But as you walk up that street, you don't realize that. And I just think that's really an interesting perspective for people to think about, and the map will really show you that. So we go to the next question. There's a gentleman at the podium.
Hi, my name is Mike Korzinski. I'm at 149 Burgett Ave in Medford, and I am what is potentially to be the UR1 district by the Green Line stop. I guess my comment is tonight that I know, this is probably a major zoning like this seems to maybe happen once or twice maybe 3 times in a lifetime. And this is maybe the first major rezoning in Medford in 30 years. And I think when I see that and this idea that, zoning isn't perfect, I believe you're in good faith trying to get it right, but I know that's difficult to do. And when I look at the 2020 recodification and the errors that were introduced, some minor errors introduced there that you didn't try to correct in 2023. And I think, it's never going to be perfect. And so it should always be more permissive rather than less permissive. And so I think like the idea of these districts like the UR1, where you're not going to allow a single family home is by right is concerning to me, because frankly, from dealing with the OCD office through multiple projects with Tufts, I lost a lot of faith in Tufts as a developer, but I also lost a lot of faith in the city. And I don't want to deal with having to come back and ask for a correction in the zoning later or anything like that. I want to be able to live by right? So I think more permissive zoning, more permissive building options in all our districts are better for, future homeowners in Medford as well. And so I would urge you guys for at least, whether it be to, call it a NR3 or allow single family in a UR1, I'm not sure I care, but I think just taking away having that by right is a detriment to an area I live in, and I just hope you do consider that. Thanks.
I second.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's another on Zoom, Sharon.
Sharon DSO.
Somebody knows her name. There you go. Did you get it? Did I get it?
We'll do it at the same time. We might as well.
It's when they unmute and you mute. And that happened too many times.
You better know we're asking to unmute.
Sharon, we're requesting that you unmute Sharon DSO. Sharon, we'll ask one more time and then we'll come back to you. We're pressing the Ask to Unmute button. There should be a pop-up on your screen that says unmute. And then when you click that, you will be able to hear you. We're going to come back to you, Sharon. So we'll go to Andrew McRobert on Zoom. Andrew, name and address. Oh, sorry. Wrong meeting.
You don't actually have to give your names and address, but it is helpful for us to understand where in the city you live. And often we just know that when you say the address.
It's amazing when you realize a new instinct.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I live on Kenmere Road in Glenwood. My question is two parts. First of all, what is the process of, for example, a convenience store opening up in a neighborhood residential district? And second, does it make sense to incorporate MX1 zones or some other zoning that can make those things by right into certain corners that are high traffic in those areas? And to give a little context of where this question is coming from, so Glenwood is NR3 under this proposal. Has a lot of tightly packed 2 and 3 family homes that would be well served and that are well served by corner stores and cafes that aren't necessarily as far as Salem Street for some of us closer on the Wellington side of Glenwood. Some that come to mind are on the corner of Central and Spring, which is near Morrison Park. We have Classic Cafe on one corner, and on the opposite corner, there's another commercial building with a couple of businesses there. I think Classic Cafe is mixed use. If I look at it right, it looks like a house with a connected, with the cafe connected to it. Another one that comes to mind is Magoon and Spring. There's Neighborhood Kitchen, Spring Street, Supret there, great little neighborhood convenience store. I would love to have more of those things accessible, close to, within walking distance, without having to necessarily go north to Salem or south to Wellington. And that's it.
So I'm practically grabbing the mic. Thank you for asking that question. And Spring Street and Macoun Street is actually one of the ones I looked at as an example of what I'm about to talk to you about in the comprehensive plan. And so one of the things that we are discussing and bringing forward, I think later in the commercial areas discussion, is this idea of the neighborhood hubs, exactly what you're talking about, existing commercial that neighborhoods are relying on. We're trying to figure out exactly how to continue to allow those. Is it just the areas that exist now? Is it a combination of different street types when they cross at intersections? What should the rules be around those? We wanted to make sure that we talked about the neighborhood districts first, and also about the commercial areas or the mixed use areas next, and then that comes in at the end of it. So we absolutely have not forgotten about those smaller neighborhood level commercial. I'm really glad you brought it up during this process. So I would expect towards the end of April maybe is about when we'd be talking about that. So thank you.
Okay, that's great to hear. That's going to be under consideration. Thank you.
Hi, Carolyn Campbell Haggerty, 49 Elmont Street. I'm here tonight because we're completely against changing the current zoning to urban 1 or 2, UR1, UR2, which has already been started to be discussing to change our neighborhoods at the last community development board meeting before we even had input. And this is a constant thing that happens in the city, is the boards and everyone are already making decisions before you listen to the community. So I'm here tonight to say definitely not either one of those in the neighborhood. The Salem Street corridor is one of the densest sections of Medford, and we don't need or want any more density in my neighborhood, our neighborhood. And especially since the city hasn't done the work to show how that will affect us day to day. We don't know. Especially in the capital plan, which recommended shadow studies, parking studies, infrastructure studies. Everyone keeps talking density, density, density. That's going to fix the housing crisis. It's not. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much.
Sharon, we're going to try you again on Zoom. We're asking that you unmute. Kit has requested that you unmute.
Few more times.
We're going to try again. If you should see a pop-up and there should be a blue button that says unmute. We can't make you unmute, sadly. We can't.
Maybe.
Well, it would solve this problem.
Maybe if she doesn't, we go back to the podium and then come back to her.
Yeah. All right, Sharon, we're going to come back to you again. Go to the podium.
Thank you. Gaston Fury, 61 Stigney Road. I just wanted to address the myth that neighborhood residential 1 does not increase density. That's actually a myth. And the reason is that by state law, one could actually build one accessory dwelling unit in those lots that goes up to 900 square feet. So 900 square feet is actually a 2-bedroom apartment. And the way the zoning is being proposed, in NR1, one could actually build a second ADU by special permit that goes up to 1,200 square feet. So if we add those of them together, that's 2,100 square feet, which is considerably bigger than the house that I live in, which is will be in NR1. And so we're effectively talking about, potentially building a second dwelling, which would be 2 ADUs combined, that is larger than a lot of the houses that are currently in NR1. So that to me sounds like a substantial increase in density in NR1. What I wanted to also ask is whether the restrictions that one has in lots in terms of open space, permeability, etc., would apply to someone trying to build, for example, a 2,100 combined 2 ADUs. Is that correct? Because I know that we touched upon that subject yesterday evening, and I was discussing with Paula outside. She was very helpful, but it wasn't completely clear, in particular on the second local ADU, whether this would apply. So if we would like to discuss this later, that's totally fine. But I was just wondering whether that would be helpful to mention right now or not.
Yeah, I'm smiling because this is a discussion we've been having internally of, we got to ask another question of, well, what happens if somebody says the current house is the ADU and then we build another house behind it? What happens if we make the ADU bigger than the principal building? And then is it really an accessory dwelling unit after all? And obviously the state ADU is limited in size. The special permit ADU, that local option, could be limited in size. We are, Alicia mentioned at the beginning that we are working with a lawyer on this, and we've asked him several legal questions about ADUs. So we haven't gotten those back yet. But I think that goes to some of this idea of whether, how you combine it. Again, an accessory dwelling unit is supposed to be accessory to the principal dwelling unit, right? So if suddenly you're adding on too many, then what is the actual accessory unit? And then the other thing about the accessory dwelling unit, it is supposed to be limited in size to be smaller than the principal dwelling unit. So it's a good question. I think we're still working out the details on those. And if you have does the city allow one ADU under the state law, the protected ADU, and a second by special permit or as of right, or how they want to do that. So we'll take that question into consideration.
I just wanted to add the comment.
I'm glad that you spoke to Paula as well. So.
Thank you. Yeah. She was very helpful, definitely.
Good.
So to me, the fact that you can build like one up to 900 or half of the size of the house, which is smaller, and then the second one by special permit would be 1,200. I see that as a loophole to sort of build, again, as I mentioned, those two combined would be considerably bigger than my current house. So I see it as a loophole to basically add an extra unit to whichever larger, maximum number of units are allowed in that district. And someone mentioned yesterday that, back when they were younger, they actually had a job and then they were renting I believe it was a 300 square foot, very minimal sort of a studio because they worked all the time and then they were there just to sleep. So they didn't need a lot of space and then we're renting that for like $200 a month, which obviously after inflation, it wouldn't apply anymore. But I think that's a kind of housing that would be very helpful to have in addition to something much bigger too. But I'm saying a broad array of sizes. And my concern is that, are we going to achieve that with the accessory dwelling units that now will turn into something that, as you mentioned, is not an accessory anymore? And so I think we should keep in mind that we should try to have the larger the most breadth possible in terms of, very small dwellings and also, big dwellings. So we can sort of have possibilities for everyone.
And we were working in a couple of different communities, as you can imagine, on similar issues. And one question that was raised at one point is, at what point does the accessory dwelling unit actually become a 2-unit dwelling?
Right.
And I think that's where the size restrictions and some of the other restrictions come in. So you're saying this really is an accessory, as opposed to you just have a 2-unit dwelling. This is the one I'm thinking of as a rural community where they already have 2-unit dwellings as of right. And so there's a difference there. I think the other thing that starts to get confusing is in the state law, they talk about the ADUs don't contribute to the density. And the definition of density that's used at that point is either dwelling units per acre, which is a common measure, or dwelling units per lot. And so if we're thinking NR1 is one principal dwelling unit per lot, but then you have an ADU. Yes, there's two dwelling units on the lot, but in terms of official density, when you have density regulations, it would be 1 dwelling unit per lot. Again, getting into the weeds, but I hear what you're saying about how do we establish the different size ranges for some of these units to give that variety of housing that we were talking about earlier in this conversation.
Okay, thank you for clarification.
Thank you.
Regardless of what the definition is, I think, if a lot of people add in 900 square feet, which again is a 2-bedroom apartment, or 1,200 square feet, which is a 3-bedroom apartment, it would completely change the character of the neighborhood. So we can argue about the definition, but I would say that does increase the density, the feel that one would feel. Anyways, thanks so much. That was very helpful.
I just wanted to add, unless you want to go first.
I was just going to give a quick that we are also, I talk regularly with developers who are looking to build bigger buildings. And they say, what is the city looking for? And we are actively encouraging them that we want smaller units, more units that are smaller is what we're looking for, because we know there are a lot of people who have 3 and 4 and 5 people living in a 3 and 4 family or 3 and 4 bedroom apartment in a 2-family house. And we'd love to see them move into their own apartments and allow that house, that apartment with 4 bedrooms to be freed up for an actual family that needs to rent, and to sort of make the balance that way. We have a lot of larger units that exist in the city. So we do ask them every day for smaller units. We've been pushing for more senior apartments, things suited for seniors and for graduate students and postdocs and people like that who might be looking for smaller units.
That's great.
Smaller houses.
Right. And that's when people who are flipping individual houses don't come in and meet with me, even when I ask them to. They don't need to. People who are building larger buildings need to go through things through like site plan review, and they do need to meet with the city and they have to work with us. So we have a lot of really productive conversations with them. So.
Great. Thank you.
I, for one, am grateful for anyone who's living in a unit with more than 2 people in it, because that's helping the cause when we have such a unit shortage. And you actually just raised an important point that I think maybe we need to factor into the multiplex discussion, which is if we're going to allow them, do they end up qualifying under site plan review? And then there's a higher threshold of regulation. So you maybe wouldn't have them coming in and just going through. So just all of these different thoughts that we've had on that tonight, that added that to me. For one, on the ADU question, I would hope that that's subject to our open space and lot coverage requirements. I don't know if the state mandated one is can't be less permissive than the single family, but that would mean that on the lot, you still could have a maximum lot coverage of 50%, and that would include the principal and accessory structure. So that, I think, is something important. And then for me, the question of the second ADU, how I envision it as a test case, and I think, and I'm not necessarily saying that everyone else on the council or the community development board or in this process would agree with me, would be that you could have, say, like a 900 square foot attached ADU, and then say you had a pre-existing carriage house or structure, that maybe that would be something that would qualify under a special permit for some reason. But I tend to agree with you that it would be a loophole if you could build a 2-unit, 2,100 square foot livable area structure behind your 1,200 square foot house and call it an accessory unit. And I don't think that's the, intent of what we're trying to do. So making sure that we match the idea of a second ADU to actual purposes and use cases that I think, have thought through more is something I definitely, and I hope we could ask to maybe Jonathan about just making sure around the dimensional requirements as well.
Right.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Right now, site plan review is required for 6 or more units, including conversion of existing dwelling to contain 6 or more units. But that's a number that the city established at some point. So any building that's going to be 6 or more units, they have to go through something that's called site plan review. I see some faces going like, what is that? So I'm just going to explain. It's where you have to come in front of, it's a publicly advertised meeting, but it's not a public hearing. It's a public meeting. And you have to submit all kinds of information about the outside of your building. What is your trees and your permeable stuff, and how are you treating lighting, and what kind of paths and sidewalks and bicycle infrastructure and all of that, and architectural features. And the CD board, this Community Development Board, which it's a appointed board. We try to have planners, architects, engineers, transportation planners, sometimes people in the construction business on that board, ask you questions and try and help make that project fit better in Medford. And the board cannot say, no, you're not allowed to build the building, but they can say, well, we'd really like to see you connect this sidewalk over here, and we'd really like to see that be grass, not turf, and this is what we'd like. And most of the time, the developers work with us and come to some sort of agreement. So if they say, no, we absolutely refuse, then it becomes a little bit difficult. But most developers will sort of say like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Or they might say, I can't do that, but what if I did this? And so it's sort of a negotiation with the board. And we typically find that developers walk away saying, well, that was helpful because I didn't know those things were important in the city of Medford, and they thought of things that I didn't think about. And often we will have immediate neighbors come and speak about what they would like to see and how they would like things to connect. So that is a process that's already built in, and that board meets twice a month with these hearings. So.
Yeah, and I just wanted to throw in, and I know we said not long answers, and this has been another long answer, but I think one of the things we're trying to balance here too is what is the threshold where more process is beneficial and what is the threshold where more process is harmful. And I think like Judy and Mike raised, if you take the single family out of the UR1, you might not be creating more process for a small property owner versus when you have a 6-unit threshold versus a 5-unit or a 4-unit threshold for site plan review. At what point is that impacting what we would consider a small property owner versus a developer, right? And that's kind of another one of these, spectrum where we're like nearing a threshold and like what is the definition that best fits? And I think that's just some of the conversations and considerations that we're taking into account.
All right. Hello, William Navarre, Bedford Street. I'll just echo quickly the NR1 in Northwest Bedford. I really think that could go up to NR2 because indeed the lots are kind of big, I guess. Another thing I want to say is just on this idea, if we want smaller units, I'm really very nervous about any per unit burden we have. If you want more smaller units, then if you do the same building and divide it into fewer bigger units, you don't have to do site plan review. That's like an incentive to do fewer bigger units in the same kind of building. So that seems the opposite of what we want. Maybe it shouldn't be units at all. Maybe it should be like square feet or floors or whatever, something other than units. If you want lots of units, don't put extra process when they put lots of units. If you want small units, if you're worried about big projects by square footage, that's a different issue than big projects by number of units. And with that, mainly I want to ask about, could we consider in some of these districts, especially the UR1 and UR2, going above just 3 stories? I wonder, I suspect that most of the time that's not going to work out for various reasons, not going to pencil out. But on the few rare circumstance where it does pencil out, won't that very often be an elevator building? And won't that help with accessibility? In addition to helping the housing shortage a little bit more? And as Gaston mentioned, you got a variety of sizes desirable. If you notice, like 6 units across 4 stories, you're almost certain, if you do all 6 units in 4 stories, probably going to have some variation in unit size, which is pretty cool, I think. And so basically, I'm interested to hear about how the zoning code interacts with the building code, both in good and bad ways. When we talk about, allowing 4-story buildings, for example. And am I right, or am I along the right track, that 3-story buildings might greater than 3-story buildings might lead to more elevator buildings and help with, accessibility? I'm wondering, am I on the right track there? Thank you.
I will address part of the height. The height map should be outside of what the current heights are. We were really looking at keeping the UR1 and UR2 to keep it that transitional piece from the neighborhood to the mixed use, keeping it pretty much to the 3-story height that's already there. You can get more units by more massing. Obviously, the building envelope that I mentioned earlier, the setbacks, the percentages would keep that down somewhat. So it's that balance of control. Our thought was that as you got into the mixed use districts, that's where you see the height transitioning up. And that means if you're going from a 2.5-story in the neighborhood districts to a 3-story in the urban districts, the urban residential districts, to 4 or more in the mixed use districts, then you get to have that transitional height. So there are building code implications for height. I'm not even going to pretend to know the detailed level of that, but I do know that it comes into effect as you transition heights. Elevators, other access, sprinkler, which is also for not just building height, but number of units in it. And of course, construction style. At a certain point, you can't do, stick built anymore. You have to move to concrete and steel. I believe that's above 6, but I'm not positive, so don't quote me on that. So certainly, what you can do under zoning is sometimes constrained by the building code and vice versa. And it's an important thing to know if you're going to develop the property. So we've sometimes run into some surprising conflicts.
Yeah, I think one of them is I can never remember exactly the thing, but the single stairwell versus the double stairwell,
Exactly.
where because you can't have apartments with a cross breeze anymore because of the building code. But I think that's state building code, and I don't think there's really anything we can.
Right, that's state building code, so it's possible that could change. The zoning could outlast, whatever the current building code is. So
that's possible. Yeah, totally. But no, and it makes me think. The more that we're having the conversations, the more I wonder if we need to add one more step of gradient or if we need to shift everything up. And, I'd be interested again in the discussion with the community development board, like, should there be an NR4, or if we end up getting rid of NR, does NR2 become NR1? I'm just saying if we end up getting rid of NR1 and then that downshifts, but then should there be a UR1, 2, and 3? And then maybe in the 1, you allow the single family. And so it just a little bit changes the scope of what we're talking about. But I'm just wondering if we got the gradient a little too constrained and either need to upshift it or add another step somewhere to better meet what some of the comments we're hearing.
Well, I'll say one more thing, and that is that when it comes to the, restricting that just to the sort of MX type of districts, I don't think we're having any, the word is eluding me, but we don't have a district that looks like a big area of MX, right? It's just like little, I don't think we have like full blocks, or we have like 5 blocks of, a 4x4 block or something of MX. We're talking about pretty small areas. So that's that means that overall in the city, we don't have any big blob of where you could have more than other than, we don't have a big area, it's only little bits and pieces is what I'm trying to get at.
And I think just, I think we're going to hit, the rubber's going to beat the road, especially on the Main Street, Medford Street corridor, where you do have the mixed use, but maybe it would make sense to have a UR3 with an incentive zone because you might want to have 4-story all residential facing the main corridor. And so I think that's something we maybe want to think about too. Or maybe it's 4 to 6, I don't know.
Well, and just to add to that, we have gradations in the mixed use, right? There's a mix 1, a mix 2, a mix 3. So now we have a neighborhood 1, 2, 3, a UR 1 and 2, a mix 1, 2, 3. Should there be a UR 3, and how do we do that? As you say, maybe what we're calling neighborhood 1 now. If we hear more testimony that should become NR2, then we rejigger the districts a little bit. So, yeah, I think there's absolutely options for rethinking, what each one means and then where it's applied. So, which is why we're here tonight. So.
And maybe we don't get rid of all of NR1,
Yeah.
a portion of NR1, but you add an NR4, and that could replace this UR1 in the Burgett Ave area, right? So maybe you would allow 4, but you wouldn't allow the multiplex, and it meets more of that lot question.
Hi, guys. My name is Ann Haggerty. I live on Sagamore Park over in West Medford. We bought our house in 1996, and we love the neighborhood. It is a lot of single-family homes. Our street is the park, which is between Grove Street and Sagamore Ave. It's a small street. And the proposal is for that particular area to become an NR3. So currently the square footage minimum is 7,000 square feet to make it a legal buildable lot. It's going to drop down to 3,000. So does that mean that if, somebody has a 12,000 square foot lot, they sell their house, could a developer tear down that, break it up into 4 3,000 square foot properties? So I don't know if you've driven Grove Street. There's no street parking on Grove Street. So several years ago, 2015, we had all the snow, and our emergency vehicles couldn't get down Sagamore Park because people were parked on both sides going to the commuter rail. And so they put up signs, and now you have to have the permit. If residents are going to be building, upwards of 4 units in a conversion in that area on Grove, and they don't have parking on the lot, where are they going to park?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're going to do a parking discussion specifically around the parking table and how it would apply to all the new zones in May. One of the things that I am really pushing that we include is that if you can't meet a certain parking minimum on a new construction, that the units can't get parking permits for the street. So essentially, it would be to say, in this new construction, and it would, there's where you're going to have one off-street parking spot per unit, and you will not have access to permit parking on the public way. And that's been effective in other communities where they're essentially trying to say, you're 1,500 feet from the commuter rail. We're trying to have this be people who either a family with a single car or carless family, and you can't park on the public way because that's not what this structure is designed for.
But realistically, you can't control for that. And if they commute with their car, they're not going to have a problem during the week. It'll be on the weekend when they're loading up the side streets.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you can control for it by parking control, right? I mean, if they're on the street without a permit, they would be ticketed.
Not on the weekends.
Ticketed.
Currently in Medford, the parking permits are 6 days a week.
Oh,
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's 6 days a week.
On our street? I don't
and
think so. I
24
think
hours.
ours is just
So I'm on the traffic commission. So we have been learning is that in Medford, every single street that has had parking, except for let's set aside the green line zone, which is brand new zone. Every single street that has residential permit parking has come to the traffic commission over the last 70 years and requested permit parking and put in front of them, these are the hours we would like permit parking, and these are the days of the week that we would like it.
Yeah.
And so there is a huge variety out there, but they all limit Monday through Friday. Most of them limit Saturday. Some of them limit Sundays. There are, in fact, some streets right near here that only require permit parking from 8 a.m. till noon. Monday through Friday.
That's our area. It's 8 a.m.
So those are very much clearly designed to prevent people from parking there and getting on the commuter rail,
Yes.
which is a fascinating to me as a planner and an environmentalist who would like people to use the commuter rail while you're away at work. We'd like them to park there and use the commuter rail. That said, we have been trying to standardize. So if a group comes in now and asks for their street to be permit parking, it is going to be Monday, 6 days a week, and it's going to be 24 hours during those 6 days. What we're hoping to do is to move more and more of the city to the zones so that you have like this zone that your permit would work in the region where your house is, but not anywhere in the city. So that you could park on the side street near you or the cross street, and because it's kind of all over the place right now.
Yeah, I mean, one of our book club members is a nurse, and she's had her driveway partially blocked. She can't get out because there's too many cars right next to her driveway. So that's a concern. I don't know if there's room to shift the edges of the NR3 designation for that area versus NR2, because to me, looking at the numbers, NR3 isn't radically different in terms of the lot size requirements, the setbacks, the number of units within the building if you do a historic conversion from UR1s and UR2s. It's going to change that neighborhood potentially. And, we've walked across High Street with our dog into the other neighborhood and watched many properties be sold, torn down, multi-million-dollar condos built up. I'm afraid this is going to incent developers to do just that. Medford's actually doing, I was curious, how are we doing with housing permits? And so I went on to that Massachusetts Housing Partnership website, and I compared Arlington, Malden, Melrose, Medford, and Somerville. And it's astonishing, the difference for Medford. We are rock stars right now in terms of compared to them. I'm like,
The site you're referring to is Residensity, right?
Yeah.
That's a very valuable site for people interested in.
and look at these other towns.
Yeah. Looks like it's mostly the big stuff.
It probably is, but that's new units.
It's like residential with density.
Oh, so they can hear you on the Zoom. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Having too much of a conversation.
I'm sorry. So I'm just showing Zach, or Zach, the charts, and the rest of the folks here, there's the charts about some of the data related to, and it's a great site. I'm a data geek, so I think you guys know that.
It's called Residensity, so RESI density, and it's put out by the Massachusetts Housing Partnership. They've got a whole lot of data on there that you can see town by town. If you're interested, and you clearly are because you're here, I highly recommend it to see what they have. It's a fantastic site. They have actually won awards for the amount of information they've put out, so it's very, very useful. Thank you for bringing it up.
Compare other neighboring towns.
Yeah.
'Cause that's what we're looking at. You know, if somebody can't buy in Medford, then they might buy in Arlington or Somerville, or right now it's expensive to buy anywhere. And I'm a little afraid of losing some of the character of our immediate neighborhood. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, considerations that we made when we're talking about where are the lines in West Medford is how the lines were drawn in the 60s under the last zoning. And it was I'm not to malign anyone who was involved in the process if they are still around, but it was very clear that the historically African-American neighborhood was put as a GR 3-unit district, and the mostly white neighborhood was single family. And I think the question is, where do you draw the line now? Do you keep the line because the existing condition of the existing housing reflects that poor decision or not?
And without a doubt. I totally agree with you. I think.
Yeah.
And that neighborhood, a lot of the people that we visit with when we're walking our dog, their kids are not able to stay. And that's unfortunate. So definitely more is better. And just because of the dynamic of Grove Street not having on-street parking, I'm just worried about filling up our street again with cars, and then we get a big snow year, and emergency vehicles can't.
And I completely, I think it's like I was just raising that point to be like, when we were looking at these lines in this neighborhood, it was like, well, we could just keep the same line, but then what dynamics are we reproducing that we don't want to be reproducing? But yeah, I think there's a lot of other considerations. And I'm going to go to Emily, who probably will say what those are in a much smarter way than I ever could.
Actually, what I was going to do is encourage you to go and talk to Paula on your way out and just show her the exact street so we can look at it. I will say that I think we've probably lost Alicia and everybody online to residentity at this point. Sorry, Alicia, for calling you out. It's all I can do not to reach over myself. It's a problem when you have data geeks, right? As we look at, there's stuff.
My degree is in economics.
Yeah. So, again, this is why we're having this conversation. We've heard from several neighborhoods around saying, hey, look, you need to look a little deeper. We want you to consider these things. I think, my mind is turning a little bit on some of the other controls that we can put in. Certainly the permitting process is one of those. The idea of maybe some additional gradation of districts. So, Paula and I and our team back at the office will get together and talk about what we've heard tonight. I'm sure she's got more to share with me as well from what she's heard. And then, as I said, this is the opportunity to come back. And even if we can't get everything changed by April 2nd, is the ability to say to the CD board, we heard a number of things. These are what we're still considering. So, we appreciate everying we've heard tonight.
Well, I really appreciate what you guys, I'm just thinking too through, my lot is about 8,400 square feet. But my house is, I think, 1,600 square feet of first and second floor livable space. So I'm thinking of a 3,000 square foot lot with a 1,500 square foot house. That's my size house on a lot that's much smaller.
But 100%, I hear what you're saying. I think one of the things that we do have to remember is that there's the other dimensional standards, right? So if you take that 3,000 square foot lot and you've put in the setbacks, you've put in the requirements for the minimum open space, the requirements for the maximum building coverage, the need to park on site, the required amount of
So
parking.
that would be required.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's where, as you start to build all of these things out, that building envelope starts to shrink a little bit. And then you've also got the height limitation in there. That's really, if you've got the building footprint and then the height takes you up, the height limitation is on the volume. So not every building can be built on a 3,000 square foot lot. So I think that's something to remember. It's particularly more important in some ways in the mixed use districts where you're having to do not just residential parking, but commercial parking, that there is all of these factors working together start to limit the size. But I hear you on the size of, okay, is it a single family house? Is it a single unit house with an ADU?
It would be 3 stories potentially.
Yes, if the NR3, that's right, exactly. So
that's a big little house.
It is, but then it's okay. Is it
and having multiples?
Yes,
on a lot that used to be a yard.
So what we've talked about internally in our team, and not just for this project, but for others, is starting to think about what's the ideal lot size for different types of housing or different types of buildings. It's a conversation that we're having now. And is it 3,000, you can do a house of this size, and 4,000, you can do that, and 20,000 square feet, you can do, there's also a limitation at the upper end.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the concerns that you're bringing forward, and we'll certainly be talking about them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
And I think, and just I wanted to make 2 other points. One, the lot sizes and the development patterns themselves are tied into these historical dynamics, and it's like, how do we have an equitable arrangement across the city where a big chunk of the city has 3,000 square foot lots,
Yeah.
and another chunk of the city has 5 to 8 to 9,000 square
Absolutely.
foot lots, and it's like, so if we just maintain everything based on the existing lot size and condition. So I think we're trying to factor all of that into somewhat of a balance. And then I think, and I'm not saying you're saying we're not.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing. 7,000 has been generous.
Yeah.
Dropping it down, I think, is understandable.
Yeah.
It's less than half.
Right. And I think like one of the issues here is, right, like when we're drawing lines, one parcel's on one side of the line and one parcel's on the other side of the line, and there's going to be disparate treatment between those two parcels, and that's where the most tension is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's like, you're close to a line, so the tension point feels a little harder than someone who's like in the center of a district, right? Where it's like everyone around me is being treated exactly the same. Right. And that's another, I mean, Somerville got rid of that by saying triple deckers everywhere, which I don't think is the approach that we're
And
taking.
you know the neighborhood well.
Yeah.
It's okay.
It's like, exactly. And that's my other, I'm going to look into this data more too, because like the interesting thing is on the population chart on the next page, doesn't have the uptick. The unit has the uptick, but the population chart doesn't have the uptick. And is that then a vacancy question, or is it a decreasing average household size question, where it's the point is like, yes, we've added all these units, but because your average household size is 1 to 2 people
You're selling $1
versus
million
3 to 4.
condos to a couple and
Exactly. And so it's like we could build 10,000 units and, we could build 1,000 units and have no impact, but maybe 10,000 units does. And it's actually the same amount of people living in the same place. And so that's, I think,
that's the thing, you can't control for who buys.
Right. And and I mean, that's the other interesting piece too, is in the developments that we're seeing come in, it's studio 1 and 2 family, and the average unit size is 800 to 900 square feet in those developments, right? That's the type of housing. So that's why most of the new build is in those 5+ unit buildings. So it's, it's, as a fellow economic stranger, a fascinating set of conditions and equations.
Yeah, excellent. All right, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
I'm sorry.
Come on up to the mic.
Oh, so this is quick, I hope. So Judith is wicked smart, so is Laurel. So the things they said about multiplexes and about retaining single families in my neighborhood, I think that would be really huge. Just because it will allow for a type of development that I hope is to scale, like really to scale and meaningful. Now, we just spent 6 months working on this Tufts deal, right? And a lot of us have decided to help with the tree canopy by planting trees in our backyards and stuff. And if you change it to these larger buildings that are 50% of the lots and that, are we going to all plant trees? We die and everybody cuts down all the trees. Like, how do we deal with the environmental, how do we deal with this, creating a united, forward-looking experience around a proper, healthy environment with trees and such?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think so. In the mixed use districts, what we've been doing is we've got the green score, right? We're requiring certain things. One of the things that we might think about is if we do the multiplex and higher as site plan review, that we could also consider adding the green score for the multiplex, and that requires certain measures that the development is being environmentally responsible, right? Is that the city is requiring developments of a certain size to address the environment. We might consider in the residential neighborhoods actually applying the green score to maybe a smaller size of building, not the single, the 2, the 3, possibly not even the lower scale 4 or so, but maybe one up above that. We can talk about that, and that might address some of those, because I agree. One of the things that we heard when we started this process is great, look at the comprehensive plan, implement that. But there was also the climate action adaptation plan. That's very important to the residents of Medford. And so we need to balance that as well. And I think maybe relooking at the green score and what's applied to it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the green score has a lot of different elements. It's a complicated equation, but essentially to maximize those environmental benefits. I just want to say 2 other things. I think if we're looking at potentially a regradation of this NR1 to 3, UR1, UR2, to add a 6th grade or shift it around a little bit, something we could also consider is, let's say that instead of UR1, we create an NR4 where you have single family by right, just for the neighborhood that you guys are in and talking about right now, since that's kind of been our reference point for it. Let's say that was NR4 instead of UR1. So maybe it's 4 units would be allowed, but it's still the lot size and height of the NR3 district. And I'm just hypothesizing right now. You could then say that in this new UR2, which might be in another part of the city, you could do the multiplex by special permit. So that would be site plan review with the ability to turn it down for certain reasons instead of by right. So there's some gradations within that shift where maybe we're adapting to what we're hearing and the conditions. The other thing we're talking about, and eventually it will align with this process, is we've been working with Trees Medford and the Energy and Environment Committee for many years on the tree ordinances, it was 1 ordinance, it's now 3 ordinances. One of them is to create a tree committee. One of them is about public trees, which are under a certain set of Massachusetts general law. So that's the trees essentially under city control and the public way. And then there's a zoning piece of this process where we're looking at how to preserve and protect trees on private property, where essentially other communities around us have implemented ordinances that say if you are removing mature trees, you have to replace them, and you have to mitigate that in some way, either through replacement or by paying a cost, or in the new site plan having something there. And that's even it's on a spectrum based on the maturity of the tree, because obviously replacing a mature tree with one other tree doesn't address the canopy question in the same way. So
it's been such devastation over the last many years, and that we're all aching so hard to get something back in place.
Yeah, so that is one of the ordinances that's a project that we're one of our, look at kid, our many projects. Anna Callahan is leading on that project as well. So, yes.
Sorry, I don't see anybody else online raising their hands. I think we've had everybody here. So please, those of you who are in the room, thank you so much for being in the room. Please stop by and look at the maps on your way out. We look forward to seeing you again at the next round. Those of you who are online, thank you so much for joining us online. Really appreciate your time and attention and questions as well. So, and we'll be at the CD board meeting on the 2nd. So thank you all.
Thank you.